Hi, I'm Susie McNabb. I co-host the Indie Fight for Women with Helen at the back and a team of people round about here, various people. I won't go through them all. You know who you are. There's also the group Fife the Wifeys. They concentrate on the coastal areas of Fife. The Indie Fight for Women are central Fife, Glenoffice and surrounding villages under the Women of Independence banner. As you'll realise, it's a Commonweal event. They're going to talk about the Commonweal later, so I won't go into that. I'm not an expert on the Commonweal. We're all here tonight to listen to this wonderful lady, Lesley Riddoch, who is a very prominent figure within the Yes campaign. Fortunately got the wrong result. But now there's a massive movement of women and men for the new cause, the new Scotland, hopefully. And Lesley is also, she's very prominent within the media, journalist, author. Her book's at the back. If anybody wants to buy one later on, I'm sure she'll be even sign it. But I won't dwell on any longer because I've actually got a sore throat and I don't want to start talking and scaring out the room. So I'll pass you on to Lesley. Is that okay? Aye, fine. That's good. Switch this off, it's just kind of, because it's a long room, I'm going to have to shout to get the back of it, so it's just anything that's competing is a bit Well, thanks very much for the invitation to come and talk. I mean, it's kind of heady stuff because I was just asking the guys when I came in, what do you think people really want to hear about? Because it could be anything. This is like a fruit bowl that's got every fruit known to womankind sitting in it, you know, and people ask you kind of, what do you want to taste first? We've got the general election that's going on. We've got the debates that just has been. We've got the 9 o'clock debate tonight, which I can see has you all on the edge of its seat. It's a prospect, you know. We've got the ongoing independence campaign. We've got various campaigns to sort of improve Scottish society, if you like. We've got the prospect of the Holyrood elections to come. I mean, in a way, it's a very sort of unnatural time in some respects, because it kind of would give you the impression that politics was all about elections and representatives and selection processes and all the things some of you may have been through if you're also members of other parties. Actually, can I just check it out? Who is a member of a party in the room? Right, aye, that's a fair wee number. And yet, I mean, to me, that, in the past at least, has only been half the battle, the business of politics that resides within political parties. And most of the political change I've seen in Scotland has actually occurred completely out with political parties. And in fact, generally in advance of political involvement. And that's just something I wanted to talk about a wee bit, because it's really where I've been coming from with the book. If you think about Scotland and think about the capacity of people in it, I think we're all beginning to get a sense now that Scots are capable of a heck of a lot more than we thought, eh? I mean, whether that's last year's Commonwealth Games in one perspective, or whether it's the huge political upsurge there's been, nobody quite ever expected this. You know, I go from meeting to meeting where people nervously stand beforehand and say, I don't know if anybody will turn up tonight. And then kind of 10 minutes later, there's 150 people again. You know, and that's become a new normal now, which is really quite extraordinary. But I wonder, in a way, where our energies are going and where they're best spent and how they get connected best to the stuff we need to shift in Scottish society. I mean, just as a wee kind of story, really, some of you may know I've been quite interested in kind of Nordic comparisons because I'm doing a bizarre PhD that compares hut traditions in Scotland and Norway. And in Norway, it's perfectly normal for everybody to have a wee weekend hut that they scoot off to every weekend. In fact, it's normal everywhere at our latitude. I've just come back from Berlin yesterday, was it? And there was, once again, there's something like, I couldn't stop myself having a little look about huts when I was there, a habit that my husband finds very irritating. And there are something like 800,000 huts in Germany, but it's got a fair old population. There are, I can tell you, 410,000 huts in Norway, and it's got a population of 5 million, which is the same as us. And there are 500 huts in Scotland. Now, that could tell you that we're not the kind of guys that like squirreling away in wee wooden huts at the weekend. Or it could tell you that throughout history, our access to the land has been diddly squat. And that we have no idea what our aptitudes are because we've had so little opportunity to find out. I notice as well, if you look at something else, the proportion of renewable energy that we have in the mix. I saw a recent poll, thankfully restating, that four-fifths of Scots put their total backing behind the idea of having a renewably fuelled Scotland. So despite, you know, some people getting into a tizzy about wind farms and so on, in general, the Scots are still saying, do you know, when you look at the alternatives, we're pretty okay with this idea of pushing the renewables. Do you know what the overall figure is for the UK in which Scottish renewables plays a part? How much of that energy mix is coming from renewable energy? And what percentage would you say? Bearing in mind Scots pumping away all its stuff and then there's the rest of England and whatever, what would you guess?
3%. 3%?
You're not far off. It's 4.2. Right? Which actually, just again to put things into perspective, the European average is 14.2%. Sweden is sitting, is actually the daddy of the lot. It's sitting at 62% of all its energy is produced from renewables. And Norway is about 51%. And the UK is at 4.2%. The only countries that were surveyed in Europe with a lower percentage of renewable energy in their mix were Malta and Luxembourg. Now, again, the reason I'm throwing all this at you is to ask, what is good enough for Scotland? You know, what kind of outcomes are good enough for us? Because I think a lot of the time people think basically doing better than England at stuff, I mean, to be blunt, is kind of a score. So the last local government elections was a 38% turnout in Scotland, which is rubbish. But the last local government elections in England, 30%. Resultamundo. Now, if you're thinking that way, you know, if that's good, if that's what success for Scotland looks like, we're lost. Because, you know, the average turnouts around Europe is about 70%. The Scandinavians often manage 80%. So if we sit in a bubble, I mean, many of us have been sometimes worried about our yes bubble, but actually I think there's an even more dangerous bubble around, and it's kind of the I-beam bubble. It's the what you know bubble. It's the kind of this'll do bubble. That's the dangerous one. This'll do bubble. That's the dangerous one. Because what we should be trying to aim for is for a country that absolutely, I'm not even saying punches at its weight, because that's a sort of metaphor I've grown as weary of as holding people's feet to the fire. Anybody else find that one a little bit kind of you know, we should be able to expect standards that are at least as high as countries that actually have less resource than we have. And when you start looking through, you know, Scotland's kind of pedigree, we've got unbelievable energy resources. You know, you're sitting at the tail end of the life cycle of one of them. But you're also probably sitting at the beginning of the life cycle of another one, once tidal kicks in, and particularly once offshore wind kicks in. And we must make that happen, because it's as doable as all the other industries that have made this area of Fife their home. But this time, we need to make sure that communities benefit from it, I'd say. And I don't mean just the Scottish community, I mean particularly communities, these communities in Fife. Because if we were to start to look at a few comparisons of how are we doing here, we're not doing very well on a number of indicators of sort of, if you like, political health. If you take for example, community control. And by this I mean democratic community organisation. We have probably got the least effective community control in Europe. And it vexes me to say it, but it's true. We have, let's take our average council size. You know we're in a bit of a honey of a council here. Fife is a big old boy. It used to have 87 councils, Fife, until 1931. Now we're in a situation where the average size of a council in Scotland is 175,000 people. Now, as usual, nobody has blinked an eyelid at that. I could have said to you, 900 million people. Yep, there's still not an eyelid blinking there. Because these numbers are like, what? Because we're so out of touch, basically, with anything to do with local democracy, we've got no way to measure that. So, here's a way to measure it. The average size of a council with much the same powers as Fife Council or the average Scottish council, the average European size of council is about 14,000 people. If you were looking at Germany, which is a pretty zingy economy and happens the World Cup, for those of you who kind of care about things like that, the average size of a council is 7,000 people. And if you look at the average physical size, it's about 15 square kilometres. The average size in Scotland, let me remind you, there's 7,000 in Germany, 175,000 in Scotland. And the average physical size, 15 square kilometres, that's probably Kirkcaldy, Kirkcaldy is probably larger than that. And in Scotland, the average physical size, 990 square kilometres. Now I can get you're not a very responsive audience, but that's different, right? And you might think, well, kind of, so what? Actually, to me, nearly a whole load of our problems as a society lie just right there. Because practically, the fact that we even dismiss the local realm as being particularly important, people will be thinking, get onto something more meaty, get onto the debates or something, get onto the election. No. Because actually 90% of the services you'll ever use in your life are consumed within 5 miles of your front door. And it's extraordinary that the local realm, which does so much to basically define your ideas of everything, distance, fairness, education, everything, is all delivered right here or not delivered. It's extraordinary that that realm is seen as so incredibly boring and so irrelevant. And to me, that's one of the biggest things we've got to get sorted. Because if you, to use a phrase which is actually Scandinavian in origin, if the in-by doesn't interest us, how are we going to get so interested in the out-by? I mean, we've been looking to get people interested in the whole idea and up for the idea of running a country when, to be honest, we are not given the powers to run a village. And some people may think that makes not much difference. I think that actually is just choking off the ability to feel what it is to be in charge of something democratically right at birth. And it raises some questions which I must say have been raised all the time I've been going around Scotland talking. Where most people will say, they feel there's a lot of centralisation in Scotland. And they wonder why a party that so desperately wants Scotland to run itself doesn't want communities to run themselves in the way that most European countries do. And I guess, part of the answer to that is I'm not sure there's a great Machiavellian plot in there. I think the thing is, it's back to that's good enough bubble. Because if you don't, wherever you grow up, you regard as perfectly normal. I get that. I mean, I grew up in Northern Ireland, as you might hear from my accent. It was perfectly normal to hear bombs going off all night. It was very normal to be in classrooms with sellotape crisscrossing across the glass, so that if there was a bomb, the glass would come in one injury minimising chunk. When I crossed the water to Scotland when I was 13, I was in classrooms with no sellotape on the windows and felt nervous. Now, okay, I was weird, it wasn't an unusual situation in Glasgow, but you absolutely get used to whatever you've been brought up with. You take it as your template, you take it as norm, you take it as the benchmark. Scotland is weird. And this is perhaps one of the most important things to get your heads round, because if you're to start trying to compare across with other small-sized North European democracies, social democracies, you just hit loads and loads of different ways in which Scotland is the odd one out. And you might have found this, if you've gone on holiday, you might go somewhere, like I've sort of started doing with the huts. Has anyone been to the Nordic countries? Right. You might go and you think, oh look, there's a lot of wee huts there. Gosh, they're a bit unusual. No. Actually, everybody's got huts, it's us that don't. Or you might actually go to allotments and find that not only do they have a heck of a lot of them, but they've also got huts in their allotments, and they're allowed to stay overnight in them. I mean, obviously they might even have sex on their allotments. And no government has seen fit to stamp down. You think, very permissive over in Norway. No. We're the only country, Britain, that has actually explicitly forbidden people to stay overnight in their huts, in case what? It's ludicrous, you can look again, look at more important matters perhaps, look at that question of democracy. You find if you look at the most functioning, highly functioning democracies, and you can do that in all sorts of different indicators, child well-being is a pretty good one, that happiness index isn't bad. The number of people who stands for election, not a bad one either. And you find all sorts of whopping great gaps where we're the odd one out. If you look in Norway, for example, 1 in 81 Norwegians stands for election locally. In Scotland, the figure is 1 in 2,071. Do you think that might be to do with the fact that councils are so large, you haven't got a Scooby, basically, where the rest of the place is? Very possibly. And we also have a much more male-dominated councillor cohort than almost anyone else. Do you think that might be due to the same thing? If you look again at this question of community control, take Sweden for example. I went there and was asking them, just how they ran their councils. And I'll grant you, people tend to go on holiday now, but you probably don't quiz people on their kind of council administration and funding structure. You've got better things to do when you're on holiday. But anyway, I'm a bit weird. So I was asking in Sweden how they arrange that, and they said, well actually, if you earn less than £35,000 a year, you don't pay a single penny in tax to central government at all. You pay all your tax to your local commune or your municipality. And when I sort of slightly raised an eyebrow at that, they said, well, how do you do it? And I thought, I wish I hadn't kind of... I said, well, we send all our money down basically to Westminster, and through gritted teeth, they send some back to Holyrood, and through more gritted teeth with a lot of conditionality, they send some to councils which are so large, I'm not entirely sure which one I'm in. And he said, right, you think we're weird? No. But that's the point, people, that is weird. Hardly anybody else is operating like that in Europe. Certainly not the kind of countries that we should be looking to be on a par with, not instantly, because a lot of them have, over centuries, had human resource advantages which we could only hope for now. Just to give you a wee 30-second kind of history lesson, honest, about the Norwegians, for example. In 1814, Norway was part of Denmark. Denmark went into the Napoleonic Wars behind Napoleon. Napoleon got gubbed, the Danes got gubbed, and the Allies came to kind of take off their colonies from them. So for a sort of exhilarating wee period, Norway looked like it might become an independent state. And the Prince of Norway called 112 men, because it was them kind of days, to a place called Eidsvoll, and in 5 weeks they wrote a constitution, which, coming in the wake of the French Revolution, was a fairly frisky one, but had one pretty standard clause in it. It enfranchised all landowners, which actually really meant all male landowners at that point, really. So overnight, 45% of men in Norway had the vote in 1814, and the same clause introduced into our British Reform Act of 1832 enfranchised 5%. Right, 45%, 5%. Now there's 200 years of that of going in different directions there. Because if you've got 45% of men, I mean that's pretty well every family is represented in an ability to vote. If you've got that from 1814, you can't act high-handedly. in a country like that. You can't sit in Oslo or Copenhagen and sort of plot with your pals how to kind of divvy up power. You can't do that because too many folk are voting. You need to get off your sorry bahookie and go out there and kind of press the flesh. In fact, lordy lordy, some of them are going to get elected. So that's a completely different way of running a country that they've been cooking away for 200 years. And it gives you the outcomes that we slaver over today. It gives you a really good decentralised power system around Norway, where they've got a 10-city system that they shove good jobs out to, they devolve university departments out to. If you've ever been to Norway, you can only stand back and marvel at the state of the bridges, tunnels, everything. It doesn't peter out to nothing the further you go north. It gives them an enormous vitality and connection with their political life. And perhaps one of the most moving tributes to that was in the wake of Anders Breivik. You remember the maniac who shot 30 or 40 kids a couple of years ago. And I don't know if you followed too much what happened after that, but I was actually in Oslo just after that. And it was really quite extraordinary because the leaders came out. First of all, they didn't blame Muslim extremists. In that little interregnum period where it had been quite reasonable to have thought perhaps that was to blame because it's so outrageous, they managed to put a sock in it. And when they realised what had happened, that the Prime Minister at the time, Jens Stoltenberg, said, we will meet this affront to democracy with more democracy. What a fabulous thing to be able to say, and everyone to be able to pick up and join in with so easily. And to me, that's the kind of society I'd like to live in, that knows its core strength so well and isn't going to be frightened out of it by one guy who's kind of got a completely different take on his country. So there's all sorts of things there, I think, that are worth considering. The other utter weird we've got, obviously, is land ownership. Now, people kind of know a bit more about this one, but I notice now, that the size of a lot of the large sporting estates is the same physical size as a lot of our councils. Now, I'm not saying one has begot the other, but it's strange how democracy has started to map and mark the kind of over-largeness, really, of the original feudal boundaries of our lives. Land is crazy. There are 500 people that own about half of Scotland. And again, nobody's batted an eyelid to that. Because you're sitting thinking, tell me something I don't know. I know you know that. But you know something? Sometimes you have to get angry about some of these things. Because we're all sitting going, yeah, I could have said 2 people own half of Scotland. Well, would it have made any difference? It's all equally not gettable. But I worry for us, because we have so little reaction now to what I'm saying. You don't even need me to say this, you know this. We can have things like Andrew Wilson, former SNP, MSP, wrote a wee thing at the weekend where he concluded it. And it's unfair in a way to sort of jump on this too much. But to me it did just sum up a problematic smugness about where Scotland is at the moment, where he said something about, is there any other country in Europe which is so modern, so ready to face the future? Yes, there is. Norway, Sweden, Finland, even the terrorists in Iceland, Denmark, Austria. You could go on. In fact, pretty well everywhere. Because pretty well everywhere is counting outcomes and tangible achievements, not wish fulfillment, as the marker of progress. And on that marker, we have not really moved an inch since the 1800s. And it's kind of depressing. But on the other hand, once you begin to be able to case the thing a bit, you realise that actually there are some fairly straightforward things we need to do as a society to start throwing 6. That's the way I would put it. Because as long as your structures are as bouf as our ones are, so your local democracy just isn't local. And to just be clear about this, I'm not getting at council laws here, I'm just getting at council structures. But you've got that limiter on any kind of community activity. And to be honest, I think part of the reason that so many people joined political parties in the wake of the referendum is because quite literally, political parties are the only game in town. You guys, if you were in any other country, half of you would be councillors. You've pre-selected that by being interested in it like this on a beautiful night, which also has an election debate on the beam. You're weird, right? You're committed. Are there any councillors in the room? Right. That's not, you wouldn't get this practically anywhere else. But because it's so hard to plug your energy into representative democracy in Scotland, you're involved in political parties instead, because you can get the plug stuck in there. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm just saying that side gets our energy too. And the fact that it is so difficult to get involved in stuff there, to me, is number 1 or number 2 or number 3 priority. Whereas for a lot of other folk, it's kind of just getting swept under the carpet. But coming back to the land thing, my family grew up, one of the legs of my family grew up in Caithness, and their family were cleared from Caithness. And of course a lot of people see this as being a pretty Highland rural issue, and by gum it is. It certainly is. I've just gone on a wee tour of the north, and everywhere I went I gave people the option what they wanted to talk about. And it could be the election, which again, nobody wanted to talk about. Beyond the election, which is kind of interesting, or land reform. Land reform every time. There are just communities who cannot do a blooming thing, bluntly. They can't get housing for their children, so they'll leave. They can't expand their businesses, so they'll stop. In fact, they don't have businesses, because you need to have land on which to put some businesses, and if it's too difficult, you just don't risk it. I mean, a great example of that, again making a wee comparison there, is looking at a town called Hammerfest in Norway. Anyone ever been to Hammerfest? It is actually the world's northernmost town. It's right up at the top of Finnmark, at the top of Norway. And it's so cold on a really cold winter, about -55, that apparently the kids can throw boiling water into the air and watch it turn to ice. And there's not very many places in Scotland that can kind of come close to that. So these guys should basically be dead. And yet, not only are they not dead, they're doing better than us, measurably, in ways that illuminate, I think, something about control. In 1897, the folk in Hammerfest became one of the first in the northern hemisphere to get street lighting. And you might think, so what? If you've experienced 3 months of Arctic winter, you kind of appreciate street lighting. So they funded it by a tax on beer, which the fishermen were a bit kind of not that keen on. But they managed to put a hydro on the back of a river at Hammerfest, and off of that they got 5 street lights. Whoa. It actually broke down a year later. There was some considerable annoyance from the fishermen, but it turned out that actually no one had ever put this kit so far north, and they just hadn't insulated it properly. So they did that, put it back, got a better drop, and by 1900, every house in Hammerfest had a light inside it. Whilst more sophisticated towns further south, like perhaps Kirkcaldy, but certainly my mum's stamping ground Wick, remained dark. And then they thought, supposing we took that hydro and kind of modified it, and modified the turbine, and put it into the Kvalsund Strait. Now this is a frisky little bit of water with a good tidal lick coming through it. And they were trying to generate tidal energy. So they did that, and they started around 1910. Off and on, they were modifying the turbine, changing the design, measuring, constantly moving where it was placed, yada yada yada. And the net of it is that this year, or perhaps early next year, their turbines, the turbines of the company Hammerfest Strom, which is the ones that started off with the street lights, their turbines will go into the water off our island of Islay to make it the world's first tidally powered island. And it should have been us. There is no reason why people living in a place so cold it should be killing them should have more intellectual capacity to harness the tides off our islands than us. I mean, do we not have engineers? Do we not have coastline? Do we not have experience of the sea? We've got all of that in spades. What we didn't have in 1897 was permission to touch a river, let alone put anything in it. let alone sugar it around in the river a bit when it didn't work, let alone stay calm when it didn't work. There's a whole bunch of bay and fishermen on your case because they've put all their beer money into it. Or, let alone, decide that actually you could modify the whole blinking thing and stick it in the sea because there was no Crown Estates Commission to be asking. In fact, the absence of forelock tugging in Norway has got a great deal to do with the success of that country. And the reason that I often relate examples like this, and in fact there's loads of them in the book, is precisely because we can't imagine how we would have been otherwise. It's hard to imagine how Scotland would have been if it hadn't been so appallingly crippled by an unprecedented degree of control of assets kept in a tiny number of hands. You can only get an idea of it by going to folk who are neighbours, who have in many other respects broad similarities with us, and standing agog when you realise how much of a head start these guys had. So, I mean, my mother, for example, who lived in Wick, they only really got electricity in the Highlands after the intervention of Tom Johnson. Anybody know Tom Johnson? Yeah?
He was the post-war Labour government Secretary of State for Scotland.
Yeah, he was. In fact, he came in at the start of the war. That's when he made his big contribution. But you're right. And again, it's extraordinary, and I'm not digging you up. I effectively had to educate myself in the course of writing that book. We don't know these things. Because this guy was a really tremendous character, Tom Johnson. He came in 1941. Churchill wanted him to be Scottish Secretary, and he only did it after the agreement that all the kind of the establishment and the lords of Scotland would actually support him, because he could see otherwise he would just be, wasting his time. And what he did was he used the Second World War to force hydro dams on Highland landowners who wouldn't give their land up for electricity. And that was well after the same sorts of schemes had been voluntarily arrived at by communities exploring their own natural assets in Norway. And even then, Tom Johnson actually was quite a lad, because when he was much younger, in 1909, he wrote a book called Our Scots Noble Families. Now, if you can get a hold of one of these, copy of that, have a look and have a laugh. Because he absolutely tears every so-called noble family to shreds in the sort of language that actually you'd be borderline whether you could get it into the National these days. It's kind of frisky stuff. So outspoken, in fact, that when he was offered that opportunity those years later by Churchill, he had to send a guy out to get all the copies of it and shred it. I kid you not. Otherwise he wouldn't have stood a chance, he thought, sitting in the same room as these very Scots nobles. But during his earlier time as well, he started off as a councillor in Kirkcaldy. And that was a kind of interesting period, because he came up with a number of great wheezes. I mean, Kirkcaldy still, bizarrely, has the Kirkcaldy municipal goat herd. It has quite a number of strange municipal assets. But the main one that it should have, it doesn't now, is the Kirkcaldy Municipal Bank. And this was set up, I think, around 1910, 1911. And the idea of it was really quite simple. What it did was, it lent to the people, it paid on savings at about 0.5% more than any other bank. So it got all the punters' money in. And it then lent to the council, charging 0.5% less to borrow than any other bank. So the net of it was that the people were happy because they were getting more money, they were getting more for their money. And that money was then being used to lend to the council to produce services for the people. Well, slap my thigh if that's not a pretty good way of operating. As a result of that, Kirkcaldy had municipal baths that were actually located beside the Lion Foundry, which was the place that built all the red telephone boxes in Britain. And those guys were well washed, let's put it that way, and they developed into swimming baths. So there could have been that kind of municipalism. That's basically the kind of size of thing and the dynamism of council that you've got across the rest of Europe. That's pretty normal. Going back to Sweden, there's 92 local energy companies in Sweden, and they're nearly all run by councils. That's what councils think they're there for. Even councils of 14,000 people. right? We have councils of 175,000 people who seem to think they're there to give their executives six-figure sum salaries. You know, the dynamism has gone and a sort of sclerotic bureaucracy has crept in, and we think that's normal. So there's all these sort of different ways in which Scotland is really needing a big spring clean. Because if we got some of these things right, if we could free up land, we would sort out housing prices at a stroke. And the evidence for that is on egg, the side People's Republic of. I was a trustee of that for 8 years, and it's astonishing in some respects that what happened, because those guys were they were no Che Guevaras. They were normal people with all sorts of misgivings about the wisdom of putting all their eggs in the one basket, their own basket. However, what they did when they managed the buyout, they raised £1.56 million, which all came from the members of the public, apart from £17,000 was all that came from the government. And there was no formal backing from any political party, including the SNP. These guys were trailblazers, because they had to be. They couldn't live like that anymore, with arbitrary threats of evictions and no chance to run the place properly because of on-high distant instructions. But the first thing they did when they got the buyout, what they did was kind of interesting. One thing was that they started to repair a lot of the houses. There were about 36 tenants there. There was about the same number of crofters and the same number of owner-occupiers. But because the landowners, particularly Keith Schellenberg, had never given anyone a lease, they couldn't apply for housing improvement grants. So the houses were rubbish. I remember there was one old lady in particular who just lived in one room of an old house with cold water until she died when she was about 91. And she had those kind of skylights that have that kind of thing at the bottom of them. And she had laced through them bricks to keep the skylights down. Actually, everybody did that, so it didn't seem unusual. So the housing conditions were rubbish. So once the island was bought, everyone thought, by gum, there is one builder on egg. He's going to clean up. And he might have thought that himself for a nanosecond until it occurred to him just quite how unpopular he'd been. Some of the guys came to have a conversation and suggested that it might be better to create a building cooperative. So the Isle of Egg Building Cooperative was set up. Simon, I think, the builder, had 3 or 4 shares and everybody else had 1. So he was okay with it, but the net of it was great. It meant that there is full employment on Egg, full-time male employment. The women, as ever, were already fully employed. So that has been a real driver on the island. And what did they do then with the first one that they renovated? Well, they had 3 main contenders, really 4. There were 2 18-year-old lassies who didn't have jobs. There was one guy who was a farmer on the island, George Carr. He was the son of Colin Carr, the main farmer there. So he had an active job, and he was living in, words can't describe the coat he was living in. And there was an old lady who was originally from Egg and was living in Mallaig. So in conventional scoring terms, she might have scored for being original, if you like, native, and old and everything else, but she probably would have used it as a second home. George had a job, and he would have scored very highly. But actually, they gave the house to the 2 lasses sharing. And actually, when I heard that, I thought, wow, because that is total common sense. They were going to keep very charge of the place, that's for sure. They were a man magnet, that's unquestionable. But more important than that, and sort of slightly related to it though, is that women depopulate places first. It's not men. And strangely, that same year, the Norwegian Minister of Agriculture, who was a woman, commissioned a formal survey to be done in Norway, which found exactly that out. That it tended to be young women who would leave a place first, because there weren't jobs for them, there wasn't respect for them, there wasn't even a place they could socialise, because the guys usually could socialise out at the Fanker, out at the fish farm, or wherever they were working. And investment always went into those kind of jobs, which left the women with nothing much to do than conform to the traditional model, which they had been educated to think more than. So the dynamics of problems are all sitting there in rural areas unless women come to the fore. And by gum they came to the fore on Egg. There's a nickname for every island in Gaelic, and the nickname of Egg is the island of the big women. How true that became, actually. So that was an extraordinary achievement, and it was done completely intuitively, which is the last thing that I really just want to talk about. It strikes me, you know, when you go through all the different advantages Scotland has, people will accept and recognise quickly that we have a lot of energy-related resource, we have a lot of tourism potential, we have a lot of manufacturing skill still. But the biggest asset we have is our people. Now at this point, when I've been talking in some other places, there's been a lot of nodding and it just stops. Because much as we'd like to think that we are our own best asset, we're just not that sure. It would be extraordinary if it was otherwise. We have, never mind the Westminster dimension of our lives, we have actually been made to swallow so much rubbish by our own people. And this is the one that is hard to say and hard to accept. But the traditions of housing in Scotland, for example, where the conditions in private housing in the late 1800s, 1900s, these were Scottish landlords that were exploiting other Scots to the point that we had the highest mortality, infant mortality, in the British Isles, including Ireland. If you've read Angela's Ashes, Scotland was worse. So we have a huge kind of difficult heritage there. And people have got no access to democracy, not really. No access to decent housing, not really. No access to local democracy, no access to land. And despite all that, we're here today. I mean, to me, if you were to look at what you would call the capacity of a people, I'd say that still having your pecker up after 300 years of that deserves a blooming Nobel Prize, actually. Because if you lived in any of the societies I've been talking about, if you lived in Norway, for example, and you want to change your local world, all you need to do is vote. It works. It's a right-sized society. Voting changes things. That's why people kind of do it. It certainly changes an awful lot because the power and the money is all local, so by God, you even know who you're actually voting for. If you live in a well-structured, right-sized democracy, then voting works, democracy works. All you have to do to change things is turn up and vote. If you want to change things in your local, immediate world, in Scotland, you have to be a hero. Voting doesn't do it. You have to be ready to give 10 years of your life, perhaps. You have to be ready to forsake your relationship or your health, very possibly the whole lot, and fail. Because that's what people have had to do in Scotland. I've told you the story of Egg. They were one of the very few that made it over the top. For every Egg, there's probably been 100, without exaggeration, other communities who've tried to do something to improve their lot and wish they'd never tried because they've ended up in a worse situation than they started. And there's also so many tales of particular people who tried to change things. Just one in particular comes to mind, the Drumchapel Men's Health Group, which was set up in 1996 by Tommy Riley, to try and get a whole bunch of men who had been forgotten about by society and who pretty well didn't have much confidence in themselves anymore, to take their own health on board and do something about it. This was a tremendously brave move in a place where being a hard man is actually hugely admired. So even being violent within your household, it wasn't that huge a biggie, given the kind of backdrop of what had happened in people's lives. But anyway, Tommy decided to try and take a bit of a stand on this. They put together the idea of a men's health group. They miraculously got 86,000 quid from the health board, and even more miraculously, Tommy got the job, not somebody from Bears Den. So they set the thing up. In the first year, half of the guys who had started it were able to give up smoking through acupuncture. There was an 18-week waiting list for aromatherapy in Drumchapel, and the most popular course was cookery, because a lot of the guys realised they might not have proper jobs again, but they had proper jobs, they were fathers. So there was a lot of complete rethinking about the way people's lives were being lived. And by the end of 1 year, they had 40 trained volunteers. Now, if any of you work in projects, you might know how valuable that is. 40 trained volunteers anywhere is pretty good in Drumchapel, that was gold dust. And the health board didn't renew the money. They didn't really explain why, they didn't have to. It was just another bureaucratic decision. Somebody said that their project had proved too hard to evaluate. I've just given you some pretty easy to pick up evaluations. Anyway, Tommy was one of the few guys who didn't drink before the project began, and he really tried for 7 months to scrape some money together to keep that thing going. And it's extraordinary. If you're an academic, you can make a life, a very nice life, going around the globe, in fact, talking about the phenomenon of Scottish men's health. But if you just happen to be at the sharp face yourself, you can't get a penny. And so it proved, after 7 months of working for nothing, there just was no money to pay the rent, nothing whatsoever, and they closed the project. I lost track of Tommy, and I got back in touch with him when I was writing the book to try and find out what had happened. It wasn't good. Tommy had started drinking when the project went belly up. He felt totally responsible for not being able to crack that problem. He became an alcoholic, his marriage split up, and he died last year of COPD at the age of 62. And that is so unnecessary and typical and shameful. And you know, what strikes me is that when people try to make a contribution to the community, and they can't do it because of this absolute brick wall of a combination of professionalism, bureaucracy, and above all, the top-downness for which Britain is renowned, and this is the structure that we really have to concentrate on changing. When you get stuck at the bottom of all of that, your energy doesn't just dissipate, I think it just comes in and eats you up. And I've seen so many people who are like this, who are eating themselves up with anger, actually. And maybe that explains some of the Scottish effect, whereby all of us, really cheerily, will die 2 years younger than our UK counterparts. That's a bit of a worrier as well. So all of this is sitting there as stuff that you need to fix, really, to let the kind of freedom or the capacity of Scots actually get somewhere. Because to me, what has been happening up till now is that we've used every inch of our energy simply trying to outwit appallingly elitist structures, trying to survive in a creative and kind of gallows-humorly way in a society in which most of the odds are completely stacked against us. Can you imagine where we might be if we took all of that rake of obstacles away and we weren't just pushing all our energy against barriers all the time, but we could actually get somewhere? And I think if we could start to do that, this question of the capacity of Scots would not be a slightly sort of embarrassed shuffle at the end of an evening. Well, I mean, we could, I'm sure. We would know by the distance travelled exactly what we're capable of. And of course this has finally a huge impact on the referendum, I think. Because, I mean, if people think they're going on a kind of particularly adventurous voyage, let's say, which independents certainly would have been, they're not just interested in the skill of the captain, which at that point was one Alex Salmon, they're interested in the skill of the crew, which is us. If you look around you at your fellow Scot, which of course you can't in a global way, you rely on the half-recited and often hackneyed and usually extremely depressing versions of Scottishness, which are delivered up by the BBC in particular. But if you were to think about your fellow Scot, if you had doubts about the capacity of that mythical person, would you be so keen to go off on a dodgy voyage with them? Would you like to be walled up for, you know, the rest of time actually, with people that you couldn't trust as far as you could throw them? Because that's the image of fellow Scots we've been given, particularly the likes of Marvin and the scheme and so on. You know, we have before us images of scary Glaswegians and scary Fifers and scary working class people who've just stopped observing all the niceties of being downtrodden because they don't give a fuck anymore. Now, that sort of thing scares the kind of decent middle class of Scotland out of their wits. And it was never raised during the election, during the referendum campaign, because it's kind of too hard to get into. But you know, if we're going to get back to that point again, and we will, we've got to get to a stage where we're able to demonstrate that the capacity of Scots is high. We know it's high. The reason that we know that it's possible to change is because we've changed all our structures to put most of the power in the people's hands. And the thought that might cross many brains, which is that actually the reason so little power is down at the grassroots, is because actually the authorities don't trust us. That little nasty thought has been expunged. And to me, we've got to do something like that to try to get people really on board for what could be the most exciting time to be alive in this country that there's ever been. Thank you very much. I'm doing this bit as well. So, anybody got thoughts, recitations, observations? Bring in the election, because after all we've got one. Aye.
I think your book is one of the most important I've read in recent years, and very readable. Thoroughly enjoyed it. You inspired me to go to Egg and Neudart a week before last, and based on what you'd said in your book, I was having conversations with the people there, and the attitude was that their life between, as it was before, and since the buyouts, both the Isle of Egg and Neudart, was night and day. So I very much appreciate your input there.
Well, thank you very much. And this lady is not related to me. Get the book. But you know, one thing I'm going to say as a marker for Egg is that what they've been able to do is do shared equity deals with young folk, so that basically they give the land for free to anyone coming in. That takes a huge wheen out of the cost of building. And you can manage to self-build a 2-bedroomed house if you don't have land costs for about £40,000 to £50,000. Now that's manageable. So, I mean, very often if I've got the slideshow here, I can show you a picture of one of the more recent people who's come to live on Egg. Actually, he's not now. Dean sea kayaked over the day of the handover on the 12th of June 1997, and he never went back. Because he met a lassie, and they now have a bairn. Now, in most other walks of life, if I was describing to you someone whose main claim to fame is that he sea kayaks, you wouldn't expect him to be the owner of a 2-bedroomed house, would you? But he lives on Egg. Now, if you get to the stage where you're able to control the land and to do deals like this, you could have that kind of result here. You could have it anywhere. Again, happily, the planning authorities seem to think it's a bit too far to get to Egg, so you know, there's always been a tradition of quite cute kind of dealing with authorities anyway. You can't tend to hide a house as well as you could hide sheep, which was an old tactic. So actually, they've managed most relationships well, and I think that's also because being a community buyout has given them more status within the barterings that go on with councils. Being a community council, with an average budget of £400 a year, that's the average in Scotland, which must be spent on stationery, you're having a laugh, right, doesn't actually get you any clout whatsoever in the eyes of any other authority. You know, so, yes, I mean, Egg is kind of a useful example for a lot of things. Aye, at the back.
How long did it take them from start to finish? You were saying it was a struggle. I just wondered how long it took them to
Well,
do the process.
in some ways it's hard to put a time on that, because you could say centuries if you're being depressing about it, because you know every generation went through wanting to do something about it. Probably from the point that anybody began making a fuss about it, it was about 8 years. It was about 10 years maybe. That's a long haul. The advantage of being pioneers like that is that by the time the land comes into your hands, by gum, you're ready for it. Because, you know, they've had to work together for all that period. They set up a kind of system like the elders of a parish church, And let me tell you, it's not a very religious island. It was just a good method, so that if they had a meeting and people didn't come, which is very common, they would go like elders in the church apparently do and visit them afterwards, so they couldn't say they'd been left out, and they knew roughly what was going on. And that didn't remove something. There was always 3 people who objected to the buyout, but it sort of neutralised their impact within that. So there was lots of canny bits of thing like that. And actually that's something I did want to stress, because as far as I can see, the times when people have been freed up to just do intuitively the way to organise something, it's extraordinary how smart people are. There's another set of people in West Wicklow Burn, which is in Rutherglen, who basically had one of the first community buyouts in 1989. And the reason you've never heard of it in the saga of Ascent, Gia, Noidart, is because a whole bunch of tower blocks sat on their land. But what they did, that year Glasgow Council had some money for refurbishment, lots of money. It put all the money onto East Wicklow Burn, which is low rise because it was easier to retrofit. And the guys in the tower blocks realised they were stuffed. So they did a pretty brave thing, which was decide to have a buyout of their flats. Now bear in mind, these flats were deemed unfixable by the council. So they were going to buy out their flats and fix them themselves. It so happened there was a Tory government at the time whose only benefit, in that kind, for them at least, was that they were very keen on taking housing out of council control, as you remember. So actually there was money being dangled if you were going to do that. So basically pinching their noses very hard, because an awful lot of them were long-term communists. They took £2 million from the government, bought their housing stock, and on something like the 29th of November 1989, they woke up as the proud owners of 900 of the crappiest flats in Europe. Now, I mean, if that's not courage, what is? Because the council had run screaming from their flats, and it runs screaming from them. You know, the least educated, the most unemployed, the most deprived, they got all the indicators. You know, you wouldn't have given those guys 10 minutes running that. And as it happens, they've gone from strength to strength. There's a waiting list to get into West Wicklow Burn, and right now, East Wicklow Burn is being demolished. And when I asked them, you know, how on earth did you manage? There's many things they did that were very cute. And, you know, did you have management experience? And they would all say, no, they have no management experience. But then somebody said, of one of the main guys, Phil Welsh, well, actually, you were a shop steward of the Boilermakers Union for 37 years. Is that not management experience? And he ran not 1, but 3 junior football teams. And I used to think junior football teams were like for 14-year-olds, but they're not. They're for the men in the audience here, and you're animals, right? And he ran 3 of them and survived. I mean, that's management experience. There was, amongst the other sort of core, they were all women. One was a nurse, Muriel Alcorn, so of course there's no management experience in being a nurse, is there? And the other 2 were shop assistants. They were sole shop assistants in one of the toughest areas of Glasgow, mediating that community day in, day out, nae cavalry, nae backup, nae police, and they had no management experience. You know, all they didn't have, that group, was a whole lot of letters after their names. And mercifully, because nobody really gave them a chance, no one came in with a clipboard and tried to sort them out. They just intuitively set up some very smart ways of dealing with people. The smartest one was that they read the Housing Act, which Thatcher passed, which gave the right to buy. So they read the right to buy legislation and noticed that if you were a fully mutual housing cooperative, the Act didn't apply to you. So basically, you could keep building because nobody was going to get the right to buy. So they formed a fully mutual housing cooperative, one of only 9 in Scotland. And they've been building away quite cheerfully for the last 30 years, while housing associations with professionals on the board have not. And what makes a fully mutual housing cooperative, I hear you ask, is it has to be completely composed of tenants. Not from anywhere else, from there. Not any professionals, just tenants. And it just strikes me that if we had more confidence in ourselves, we could easily have had 30 years of house building. but we don't. So it's important, these kind of questions. It may take some time. It took the West Wicklow Burn folk 8 months to decide to do the buyout. A much, much shorter period of time, which is actually astonishing. So I think it's there, you know, when there's a moment and there's enough of a kind of threat, because these guys' tower blocks were falling to pieces, you know, so they knew they had to do something to fix them. Then that's a real thing that coalesces people and folk can get going. The more difficult scenario is when you aren't faced with some life-shortening threat. And that's where most of us live. We don't live, mercifully, in tower blocks that are about to fall down, or islands where one guy can decide if you get evicted or not. That's a more difficult area, the central area. But that's where I think government can be making life easier by just making it normal for control to be shunted further and further down the food chain. Hi.
And can I make a link with what you just said? One of the things that I used to do when I was wee was attend pendants and warrant sales in Whittleborough. A lot of people were involved in the anti-poll tax movement. It politicised many people. How, at this juncture, do we prevent that from being dissipated in the way that it very much was in the 1990s after the poll tax was abolished?
That's a very good question, actually.
And I suppose the answer is going to be it's in our hands to prevent that.
Well, it is, but I still think I'm a great believer in changing structures. You know, there's a huge emphasis in Scotland in rolling your sleeves up and getting on with it yourself. And that's mostly because we've had to do that, because in a sense, the politicians haven't been our friends. The power has been too far away to even think about it. So if you're waiting for the cavalry to come, you're going to be waiting a long time. So, you know, we've always got that feeling that we've basically got to do something ourselves. But, I mean, we have now got a Scottish Parliament. We have got a government which, on the face of it, is pro-Scots, and that would mean pro-working Scots, pro-the-majority. But I don't think we've got, at the moment, a government that's brave enough to shift around the machinery too much. At the moment, I think some of that's been covered up by the fact that we're in a constant series of election cycles. So it's very much easier to go in and, you know, talk the game that has to be talked to try to get a toehold at Westminster. But all the time, there's still these questions to be asked. The land reform bill that's going through isn't really going to make a big difference in probably any of our lifetimes. It needs to make a difference in 5 years, I'd say, or a lot of Scots will leave. And equally, a community empowerment bill is going through. It's neither knocking community councils on the head and putting them out of their misery, nor giving them function and budget and standing them up as the new kind of authority, you know, a new kind of small parish council, town council. So, you know, what's happening there? And my worry is that we're not interested, the movement is not as interested in that. It's a bit kind of icky, it's a bit kind of complicated and whatever. It's far easier to get back onto the sovereignty questions because they're kind of big and emotional and up. But we're still sitting with this pretty messy situation. And my hope is, particularly, that people who are members of the SNP and the Greens, but particularly the SNP, start to get a bit canny before the next conference and start tabling some really useful motions which would look at ways to try and change some of these structures. On the land reform thing, I've suggested myself in a national column last week, I think, that we actually have a land reform, what we call it, gathering or festival, because demonstration sounds a little bit too scary, although I quite like the idea of that too. It's somewhere in the Highlands probably, to let the Highland folk come out and see that they actually have got the guts to come out and demand change. Because I think at the moment what's happening is that things like the land reform bill are being described in the kind of posh salons of Perthshire as a Mugabe-style land trade. And, you know, Nicola has been described as a communist, and I've been described as a tricoteuse, which is one of the lassies that sat at the foot of the guillotine in France knitting jumpers. Now, this is kind of crazy, because what makes it look as if what's being suggested is the most extraordinarily radical stuff you've ever come across in your puff, and it just ain't. But what's missing is any more radical voice. And to me, this is where we have to start thinking about an opposition within Scotland to the SNP for its own blinking good, for our good. Because otherwise, Nicola, who is on this, a pretty middle-of-the-road First Minister, is being portrayed as a communist. Well, we probably need to get something in that's a bit more communist to give that spectrum its proper, its proper entity.
Aye. I think there's a huge level of discussion going on all over Scotland about land rights and land reform. But it's been happening at the festivals where the young people are out on the fields, where people my age are also out in the fields. This is a kind of, my head goes back to the 60s, the 70s, where in the 70s when Margaret Thatcher was presenting complete crap coming out of the television screen, there was a huge mobilisation of people. But they mobilised against us, their worst policing. They battered the blazes out of our young people that gathered around Glen Eagles for the G8. And so the sense in which anyone who's even in the room is a hero, because of the level at which we have been targeted in every way possible, because we put our heads up above the parapet, is real. And I've got friends who go, why won't they? Oh! And I go, well, quite honestly, you really don't believe that the government should be run by people who own all the land, who own all the means of production, and you're opposing them every day, so why do you expect them to like you? It's easier, as you said, it's easier when the opposition's really clear, and you're feeling that you're threatened, that you're hungry. But we're in a situation where we're still battling this kind of squelchiness that's about, oh well, I might lose my car, I might lose my, the bigger house I wanted. And we're going, hang on a minute here, there's folk dying every day. Our culture survives at all because other people's children all over the world are dying on rubbish heaps. And the level of anger that it's possible to raise about that is very real. But the anger is useless if it's just eating you. It's how you mobilise with it. And how you do that so that you don't become a target for the police force again. And here in this county they know about that. Because you want to oppose the closing of mines and they will bus up policemen to batter the blazes out of you. And it's that level at which all over the country there are people who ran to the hills. It didn't really matter whether you were opposing the closure of mines or if you were opposing the education cuts or if you were standing at the gates of Fast Lane. You became visible and batterable. And that's a reality that we're still having to heal people from. And healing people in Fife from that is about healing families that were split between this man's in the police force and that man's on the edge of the mine gates. How close are they to the place where these people will cooperate to be the corporation, to be the council, to be cooperating with one another, when it's really hard to get folk to come from one end of the town to the other to go and see something, to be present. It's wonderful there's so many people here. Excuse me, Caroline.
Well, I quite agree that we conduct an awful lot of politics as if very clear ley lines of human dynamics didn't exist. And where it's entirely true that there are certain kinds of people who will not be seen dead in the company of others, and there are big fault lines in every so-called community which can't be healed because there's no power at that level to do any healing. And then it gets quite difficult to start arguing for more local power, because quite often people's experience of local is bad. It's as bad as Belfast was, it's as bad as anything that you've described there. But actually, it strikes me that most of the difficulty comes from the sheer absence of democratic power where you need it.
Yes.
I mean, if you don't shine that democratic light and have the power there, all of this stuff just festers. People project onto one another, people displace. These are all normal things for people to do. You can't hardly blame people for it. But whilst there's so much of that going on, it's very difficult to get the show on the road and get the tedious business of trying to set up a decent society properly, particularly at that grassroots level. So you're right to say all of that. I mean, very often when we get more talk about local power, people will bring up all sorts of examples of where things went completely cockamamie when somebody tried. But within a situation and a kind of default, which, and this is kind of speaks to your point too, in which we are so unbelievably top-down organised. This is the difficulty. We hardly notice how much that is the normality of it all. And other societies simply have got much, much more of a grassroots up way of working. And not an absence of problems, but the will to be able to sort them out, really. So, yeah.
I actually heard at one of these festivals, an Indian brave, as it were, you know, he had been invited to come and speak at Ecotopia. And he said he thought twice about coming because he was coming from America to Scotland, and it were the Scottish soldiers that had annihilated his tribe. Because, as you know, they started on us, and they sent our men to wipe out the native people of every other country in the world. And he said he decided that he had to come and look to try to understand how it would be possible for a people to be so cruel. And he said he was glad he had taken up the invitation to come, that he had met a lot of wonderful people, and he understood that we were actually worse off than his tribe on the reservation because we had to pay to take our fish out of our own rivers. And that was in the 1980s. And that's still real. But how we move to the next step in conjunction with one another and the potential government is, it's a question I'm asking. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm still going. Come on, we're here again.
Well, this I think, I know there's a kind of tendency to favour a silver bullet solution on all sides. The media like it because you can put it in the diary and just get your guys to turn up, cover it, it's pretty easy. People like it because it feels like you've only got to do one thing and then it's all done. And actually, change doesn't really tend to happen that way particularly. It happens a little bit everywhere below the radar. That to me is how most important change has happened. That's why it doesn't get covered on the media, because it's not written into a kind of diary anywhere, and yet it's quite powerful because it's as hard to stop as the spring. You look outside there and you just look at something that is just going to happen a little bit everywhere. There's not one big spring moment, it just is everywhere. And I think political change is a bit the same. That's not to say it doesn't need a bit of kind of organising. But I see the beginnings of things. There's a group, for example, do any of you know about the Castle Tavern buyout nonsense story?
I know the name, but I don't know any of the details.
Can I just ask, how many of you buy the National here? Because it would probably be quite useful to buy it before it goes out of business. But still, well, Castle Tavern was a big, very posh mansion to the south of Dunoon. It is, which interestingly, perhaps, was built by a former Lord Provost of Glasgow. There's almost nothing I can think of that's large enough to compare it with in Kirkcaldy, except perhaps the building the library's in here. It's that big and posh. Anyway, it was bought over by the Coates family of Paisley at one stage. They were the big textile magnates, and they put in Italian marble and Italian landscaping, so it's pretty posh. Somehow, it kind of fell on its uppers enough that Glasgow Council inherited it, and then when there was council change, Argyll and Bute got it. And it sort of didn't really do anything after that, because no one quite knew what to do with a building that size. So anyway, coming to today, folk in Dunoon are basically very worried that the community is falling to pieces after the Americans left, blah, blah, blah. So what they wanted to do was to buy out that house, mostly not for the building itself. Most of the buyouts have found that the big house is a complete liability. And if you can find somebody who will take it on, get rid of it, So they found a company that do outdoor bound type holidays and had been doing it actually off and on in the premises. What they really wanted was the land, so they could have allotments, which you wouldn't believe in Dunoon is almost impossible to get from the council, and lots of workshops in the outbuildings, and a creche and a tea room and all sorts of other stuff to stimulate that end of Dunoon, of South Cowell. So they went through all the hoops. I know because I launched the formal proceedings. They got something like a 70% turnout. It was about 70% yes. It was all done the right way. They made an application to the Community Land Fund. They got 750,000 quid. They were there to smack the money on the counter and say, let's do it. When the council doubled the asking price. On the basis that they got another surveyor in who'd given a higher survey value on the premises. Now actually, yet another set of surveyors had been in and had calculated that the whole thing was so riddled with rot and lead piping that it would take 5 million quid to just bring it up to habitable standards. But anyway, so here we have the council, which is supposed to represent the community, led by a guy actually who lives in Dunoon. He's the councillor for Dunoon, basically playing fast and loose with a community that's gone through all the hoops. So they tried and tried to shame them. They organised a campaign. Many of you perhaps signed a petition for all of this. But in the end, the council absolutely held fast to this nonsensical view, having sent emails to these guys saying, we could lend you £1 million, and then when you're not able to pay, because obviously your business plan shows you won't be able to repay that kind of money, we can repossess the asset. As if that was any kind of solution, the game-playing nonsense of the whole thing. So anyway, the final meeting happened. They voted not to even discuss the issue. After people travelled 3 hours from Dunoon to Lochgilphead, the HQ, typical again for Scotland that it would take that long in a round trip for your local headquarters. And that seemed to be an end to it, except it's not. The people from South Cowell are now quite determined to devise a new template for local democracy in Scotland. And they're having a meeting in Oban on June the 6th. And if anybody's interested in that particularly, come and speak to me at the end, because I'm feeding people's names back to them. They'll advertise it soon when they know they've got the capacity to handle a lot of interest, because right now they haven't. And I really admire that, because I said to them, you know, why have you taken it upon yourselves to do this? And they said, well, we may not know the most technically about local democracy and everything, but we're the angriest. And actually, that usually is enough to get you kind of off the ground. So there's initiatives starting like that. I think it's very important, personally, that little buds like that are very protected, because that's all the right way. That's grassroots, from the grassroots, people who know the hard way how not to do it, and they're now thinking in a very constructive, cooperative way about how to pull everyone together to sort of crowdsource a local democracy for Scotland. So I would suggest that's a very good place to put some energy. And that's just one example of things. The idea of the land festival will come off, but personally speaking, I can't organise everything. So I've made the Highlanders do this themselves, and it's working on West Coast time at the moment, so it's not come out the other end yet. But I think that one will happen as well. And you're doing probably stuff within Commonweal that's very important on specific projects as well. But I think it's good now to try to, you know, up the ante a bit. Because on those two things, local democracy and land ownership, they're both the subject of bills that are going to pass through the Scottish Government and Parliament in the next year. So either we all sit there and go, oh, okay, that's fine, because we couldn't really figure out how to say anything about it, or we kind of figure out ways to do something. And I suggest, and I have suggested to most meetings, that, you know, maybe you could, after people like me have gone away, not tonight, because after all we've got a very exciting debate to go home and watch. For your next meeting, it might be an idea to just sit and think about something tangible that you could come around. I mean, every meeting that I was speaking to would find there was something. There was a bunch of people in Strathpeffer. There's about 150 of them turned up actually, and they said, yeah, exactly. They all looked at each other, and I thought, it's extraordinary. Every community knows there's something. And somebody said, it's a cycle path. And I thought, okay, not that revolutionary perhaps. And they said, yeah, but it is, because they've spent years trying to get a cycle path from Dingwall to Strathpeffer. and there's one landowner with a 200-metre bit of land who will not let it go ahead, and it has been scrapped because of that. And I said, well, I suppose you could do something about it. And at that point, there'd been two big guys sitting in the front row who were not communicative, were sitting kind of with their heads down just throughout the whole thing. And I thought they were asleep, actually. And one of them sat up and said, I've got a digger. And it was like the whole meeting just went. There was a woman at the back said, I've got a clipboard for names. And right around 60 people signed up to do the path, including people putting in details that weren't asked for, like, I have contacts in planning. And you know, when I saw it, I thought, now that is good. Because there's always something like that to focus on. It's a question of trying to get to something that feels authentic, authentically bothers people, and is in the range of your interests enough to know that you'd go the extra mile for it. There's no point in having sort of synthetic goals of stuff that somebody else thinks is important. It really hinges on something that's happening here, where people have just thought, you know, enough already. And it might be something that you can push. And a good example of it, actually, is Women for Independence in Edinburgh. I was speaking at a meeting there at Christmas, actually, when somebody raised the question of the women's prison in Greenock. And we were about to move on to other issues, and I said, well, why don't we just talk about this one? So we actually spent the entire thing just talking about that, and with people raising whatever problems they had. It wasn't a complete right-on-year roll there with it. There was quite a lot of, well, what else are we going to do with women who are in jail? In fact, we realised we were in a place called the Serenity Cafe, which is a sort of stopover type place as an alternative to prison for women. So actually, the women we needed to speak to were through the wall, doing the teas. So there was a big moment where somebody went and brought some of them through, and an even bigger moment when they came through and just started talking about their own stories. I mean, honestly, it was so raw and so real, it was tremendous. And that's what made that group pass a motion after a little suggestion that some formal thing like that would be useful, to say that they opposed the Greenock prison. And then they put it around other branches and put it into Women for Indy's central mechanism. And then Kezia Dugdale and Jim Murphy tried to steal credit for it. But, you know, it doesn't really matter. It got traction. You know, so branches who get their teeth into a specific thing, not everything, but something, I think that's a great way forward. I'm a great believer in practical project forming, because then it's like that moment. I've got a digger, I know people in planning. As soon as you've got a project, all your abilities can come to bear on it. So you could do that the next time, maybe just discuss what that is, have a thought of a few things that it might be.
Hi, I'd just like to say, whilst we're psyched up and looking for a project, I think one of the major issues affecting this area right now is fracking. And I just think it's something we need to bear in mind and get behind. I think they've even granted new licences to Prospect and Dyser. So I mean, this moratorium hasn't put an end to anything. It's still very much an issue. I think there is a bit of apathy around here. I mean, I don't think we quite realise the implications of what this is going to do to our community.
Are you want to say something on that one or anything?
The fracking thing, I think there are groups that deal with fracking. I think something local that's not being dealt with is the closure of Fair Isle Clinic, which is kind of small and manageable for a little group of people. And it's a clinic where they have child psychological services, which are now being moved to Whiteman's Brae, which is the adult psychiatric service unit in Fife. And I'm sorry, because I was thinking about it, we were saying something small and local that we can do something about, and I think if an area of Kirkcaldy, they were speaking about it at one of the last SNP meetings that I attended, if an area of Kirkcaldy needed attention, it's Temple Hall. And if an area of Kirkcaldy needed psychological services in place for children, it's Temple Hall, and I don't know if either Women for Indy or Commonweal 5 would be interested in doing something practical about that.
Right. Has anybody
That
got
news
questions
people
about that?
that clinic. Yeah, it was someone who works there had brought it up at one of the SNP meetings, but that's like you're saying, you know, people just don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
And I'd only heard it by chance because I've gone along to listen about something else.
Well, certainly the thing I noticed when you do get an absolute zinger, and I'm not saying it has to happen this way all the time, but just with the Strathpeffer one, it was extraordinary how much people were able to say, actually, you know, they've only owned the land for 5 years as well. And you think, well, that's a lot for you to know on a project you weren't going to do. And then other people would come in and say, and actually it used to be a right of way because it whatever. And you think, again, people have been knitting this together in their heads before they actually outed themselves, if you know what I mean. So some of the best ones are like that. But in the absence of that, then, you know, because I mean, I'm not hearing everyone, you are perhaps a reserved audience, perhaps you are now going to want to go home. But I haven't heard you yet and go, whoa, yes, you know. So you need to perhaps talk longer, because there wasn't an immediate goal on the women's prisons one. But there's also a gentleman at the back who's got a thought.
No, just on the fracking, I'm actually part of the group Frack Off 5. And if you're on Facebook, if you actually just go, there's a Facebook page with a link into the Scottish anti-fracking groups and the national anti-fracking group. We have been holding meetings sort of throughout sort of the central Fife area, and we will continue, but we need more help, we need more people to sign up, because this is going to happen very soon. East Weems has just been sold off to Clough Natural Resources, so it is going to happen. I also represent the People's Assembly, Scotland, the People's Assembly 5, and we've been doing small campaigns. We've done a campaign against benefit sanctions. The council just the other week, the SNP and Labour councils agreed a motion condemning the sanctions that are going on. 2 weeks prior to that, we demonstrated outside the council offices against the austerity and against the cuts that the council were going to do. After we embarrassed them in the newspapers for acting like schoolboys during the debate, the following week the SNP and the Labour councillors got together and agreed a joint motion condemning austerity from Holyrood and Westminster. Grassroots movements work. That you need to be organised, you need to be methodical, and you need to be in for the long haul, because I've been doing this People's Assembly thing for 2 years now, and that's the first real successes we've had. That it can happen, it can work.
Yeah, again, it's just worth, you know, having another meeting and having all these ideas up, and see which one or two you might want to move forward on. I mean, it's up to you tactically how you work, but it just strikes me it's very useful to have one or two right in front of you, so you're not trying to solve every problem in the world simultaneously, but you're trying to get one or two which have perhaps reasons of expertise within the group, topicality, winnability. You know, all these things you can permit out and figure out which ones you feel like going for, and then figure out how to do it. Because what people have to start learning in Scotland is how to win. You know, we've all learned how to lose gallantly, lose tremendously gallantly. I mean, by gum, we can lose better than anybody else in the world, you know. I mean, everybody notices that of the Scots, what a good set of losers we are. And that's a bad skill to see in your skill set after a while, you know. So I applaud what's been happening with the People's Assembly. Maybe that's something that you could focus on next time and just get down to one or two campaigns and agree it between yourselves, but be very honest. If there's things if it doesn't sound like a good one to you, you need to be honest. You need to be, you know, in that kind of environment, needs a well-facilitated meeting, you could do that. Right, any couple of other questions? Does anyone want to talk about this blinking election, or should we just not bother? It's actually fantastic we've got this far without having to mention it, you know. But still is there. The gentleman in the back and then yourself.
Myself?
Aye, sorry, in the middle.
Yeah, cheers. Listening to the debate between the four leaders yesterday, one thing that struck me is kind of the elephant in the room that nobody was addressing. They're talking about the national debt and playing down the deficit, and Nicola Sturgeon was the only one different, and she said we'd play it down a bit more slowly. But it got me thinking, well, who actually do we owe this money to? Where is it actually all going? You know, because this is the wealth of the nation being funneled somewhere that is supposedly is keeping back the National Health Service and the police, and is driving people into poverty and all these things. I think, is this money actually going to people with faces and names, or is it some kind of fictional thing written in transactionese that is actually a fabrication, a system that has kind of outgrown reality and is just kind of trampling on people. So I started looking into it. I found an interesting concept just this morning called odious debt. Lovely term. And it covers things like if a dictator takes on loans to build palaces and to acquire equipment for suppressing his own people, then that's not in the interests of the state, it's not in the interests of the people. So if there's a regime change and the dictator's got rid of, then the people can say, well, that actually wasn't a debt incurred by the state, that was a debt incurred by a particular regime, a particular dictator. We are not responsible for it, we will default on it, we will not honour that debt because it was not taken on in our name. And so I was thinking, well, of the debt that supposedly has to be repaid, how much of it actually was incurred in